Welcome back to part two of our deep dive into some of the research that's useful for thinking about how our kids engage with digital media. Now, previously we looked at historical examples of how kids' exposure to emerging media forms generated fears that it would rot the brain or create lazy parents and lazy kids and an atmosphere of excess indulgence. So, in this video, we'll look at what the research today says about contemporary media. So, with the first one, rotting the brain. We get quotes like this one about how the modern world overwhelms people with data, and this is confusing and harmful to the mind. So, this quote, of course, was part of a letter sent to all the monarchs of Europe, imploring them to restrict the spread of the printing press before it could rot the brains of their subjects. And as we talked about in the first video, even scholarly medical journals in the 1800s would talk about how reading books would exhaust children's brains and nervous systems and ruin their bodies by protracted imprisonment. And within my lifetime, there's been all sorts of fears about how much things like email would rot the brain, how Facebook causes cancer, and a whole host of other problems. But currently, the media forms making the most headlines for rotting kids' brains are television and video games. The two arguments I hear most often are how watching screens will flood the brain with dopamine, which is the same reaction as a substance like heroin, and how MRI imaging shows how the same parts of the brain light up, like that of a drug addict, when watching a screen. What's usually left out of these arguments is how these metrics compare to any other non screen activities in a kid's life. If you really want to understand this phenomenon better, clinical psychologists and researchers like Dr. Cohort have great videos you can watch here breaking it down. In her other videos, she does a great job discussing the concept of addiction, discussing how she, as a clinical psychologist, thinks about the term very different than the popular notions of it. But in short, dopamine is released in pretty much any of the activities you're doing when you're actively engaged and motivated. Right? If you're watching a movie where perhaps you find one of the actors to be physically attractive, that's going to surge way more dopamine than playing a video game. And if you're actively engaged in like playing or even watching a sporting event, that's going to involve dopamine levels more in line with playing a video game than the levels involved when consuming a drug like heroin, in which case the levels of dopamine we'd be talking about would be exponentially thousands of times higher. So, while headlines about how media usage can be likened to drug use is somehow very catchy, and I could make entire videos filled up with examples of how successful at grabbing attention headlines have been throughout history when they warn about how similar to drug use books or radio or comic books or pinball machines or any other forms of media are. The common theme is that when we look into the details of these claims, they never were, and still aren't, as sensational as they appear to be. One newer twist to the media rots the brain argument is the use of MRI machines to show active brain scans while a participant is viewing media. Typically, the story goes something like this. An image like this one, currently shown on the screen, is presented. The reader is told that it represents a child playing video games. They are then told that the parts lit up are all the same ones associated with addictive drug use, or gambling, or sex, or some other deviant behavior. And therefore, parents should regulate children's media usage with the same vigilance they use to keep kids sober and out of trouble. So, what's the story behind the particular image shown on the screen here? It is indeed an example where all the same parts of the brain are lit up as when using drugs or gambling or sex or other deviant behaviors. But it's not from watching a screen. It's actually taken from participants in a study on prayer and reading holy scriptures. You can search This Is Your Brain on God if you want to see the source. It's also the same parts that are lit up when enjoying music, forming healthy emotional connections, or again, any other activity with a strong inherent motivational component to it. There are very natural and very healthy reasons why the brain generates dopamine, especially when it's engaged in exploring new things. So, both before and now, there's a clear motivation for certain headlines to be promoted in the media. But what does the actual research say? While there's lots of research being done that actually shows great benefits to playing video games out there, which I think is way more compelling and conducted with more rigorous research than the brain scans that focus on the negative effects. Ultimately, though, we're still in the infancy of brain research conducted via neurological scans, and the conclusions parents can effectively take from them in order to make parenting decisions in their everyday lives should reflect that, regardless of which side you land on. In part three of this series, we'll pick back up with some of these studies when we look broader at the more traditional cognitive psychology and education research has to say about best parenting practices for modern media usage. But if you dive into the historical research and compare it to the sentiments today, both then and now, behind all the concerns around rotting brains, there's a sense of guilt around letting kids use new media forms. Feeling of neglect that creeps up when kids are engaging in an activity that's still a bit mysterious to parents who are uncertain what's actually going on and if they should be intervening to direct them towards more familiar and classical activities, which leads to statements like saying, well, I guess it's okay within limits of moderation, as long as it's not being used as a babysitter. So let's break apart these two concepts of moderation and media being used as a babysitter for lazy parents. So let's start with the babysitter part of that statement. This can get difficult to discuss because in this discussion, we have to think about two really unrelated discussions at once, and often things get confusing between them. First, we have one discussion about digital screens versus more traditional activities. Then we have another discussion about interactive parenting time versus independent playtime. And then there's the overlap between the two discussions to think about. The safest feeling quadrant here is always going to be the physical interactive quadrant. It involves classical activities that everyone feels familiar with, directly interacting with a child who will very quickly tell you if you're doing something wrong. In other words, it's much harder to screw up than the other ones. Some people might be tempted to believe that this quadrant is superior to all the others and that, simply put, the more time a children gets to have with a parent who's dedicated enough to exclusively keep them in this quadrant, the better off that kid is. And in some cases, that may be true. As I mentioned, it is the safest quadrant, both because it feels familiar and it literally forces the parent to notice the children's needs and interests. But if a parent is putting thought into the physical and independent quadrant in the top left, observing the child as they play, setting up the play space to maximize creative possibilities, having meaningful discussions with them in between their focused independent times, the physical and independent quadrant is actually extremely important too. So the lower left quadrant is the one that feels safest to everybody. The upper left and even the lower right are generally less instantly comfortable with parents, but most feel okay with them after thinking about it for a little. But how do we make sense of independent time with media? What do we make of the controversial top right? First, let's start by thinking about independent time consuming media in more traditional forms. Let's imagine we have a kid who's old enough to be able to read and they want to spend a few hours reading their favorite book by themselves. As we discussed before, in historical times, this would have set off all sorts of alarm bells about letting a kid get so addicted that they would spend excessive amounts of time rotting their brains away reading some fantasy novel. But nowadays, spending hours reading a book is a much more permissible activity. And nowadays, there's lots of research in the education community around the optimal ways for parents to handle this situation. One would be to first let the kid read the novel fully independently. Then next, a parent would ideally interact with the kid by having discussions with them about the context of the novel, asking them to summarize the plot, talk about the characters, what they liked about them, what they found interesting, all that. And finally, ideally, they would then aid and assist them in any desires the kid has to produce their own content related to the story, such as writing or drawing their own story, using some of the characters from the story that they had read. If all of these steps are done together, I could make many hours of videos enumerating all the overwhelming positive outcomes detailed in the parenting research out there. Rebecca Black, in particular, has lots of great research on the optimal ways to inspire young writers and details about how participating in fan fiction enriches the lives of young kids. But in the first of these steps, and potentially the third, you essentially are just letting the book function as a babysitter. You're not directly involved in any way. And you could be somewhat free to go about your day and do whatever it is you would like to fulfill your own personal needs. So now let's imagine what this could look like as applied to video games or television, as all the underlying principles really are the same across all the new media. Particularly if you decide to keep the volume on the television limited, but then turn on closed captioning, huge extra brownie points if you do that. It's great for kind of reading development. So let's say that you set aside an hour for your kid to independently play a game or watch a television show. As we'll get to in the next video, there's some fantastic games and shows you could choose from with wonderful learning benefits. But regardless of which game or show you pick, let's imagine that you just leave them independently with that. With that hour, you get half an hour to take a rest and half an hour to get dinner made. During that first half hour, you listen to whatever it is you personally find engaging and compelling. As discussed in my other video summarizing the book Mind in the Making, parents figuring out how to de-stress themselves is one of the most important practices in the success of a child. And parents figuring out how to keep their own brains engaged and stimulated, rather than becoming resentful of having to spend the whole day just singing about how the wheels on the bus go round and round, is a huge component of that. It's what's best for both you and your child. So let's say that for the first half hour, while the screen is quote unquote babysitting your child, or more accurately, they're engaging in independent play with digital media. Then for the second half hour, while you're making dinner, you find a YouTube video that summarizes the games the kids are playing or talks about the television show they're watching. Like, what are the characters in their media? What are their personalities? And what aspects do you want to be able to have teachable moments with your kids around? Then during dinner, you spark up a conversation with your kids saying something like, "Hey, you were just playing such and such a game, right? Is such and such a character in that game? Isn't it great the way such and such a character has this or that personality?" So then, after you pick up their jaw off the kitchen table from knowing so much about their cool media world that they love, you then have just a lively and engaging dinner conversation using their fictional world as a launching board into it. Then, after dinner, you ask them, "Hey, what do you think such and such a character was like as a kid?" And maybe they'll respond to something like, "Oh, I bet he loved eating chocolate ice cream while playing the piano." So then you put those parameters into an online image generator and instantly make a bunch of images representing what your child imagined their game or TV show characters were like in different contexts. Then you print out those images, cut them out, and write a comic book together telling a new story about what their favorite fictional character did outside of the main story, which finally you read back to them as their evening bedtime story that they produced as an extension of their own favorite story world. So, whomever the parent is in this little vignette, they've incorporated absolutely countless educational principles of everything I can think of as my decade working as a researcher in the MIT teacher education program or all my time studying cognitive development. There's just so many levels of richness in the activities described by this hypothetical parent that I just talked about. But all of it began by them not feeling guilted out of having their own time while the media, quote unquote, babysat their child. Rather, they recognize the power that comes when we can take advantage of the synergy between both independent and interactive forms of play, both with and without media, digital and not. So let's go back to the original statement we often hear. Well, I guess it's okay within the limits of moderation, as long as it's not being used as a babysitter. Now, let's look at the moderation part of that statement. The first challenge with using a term like moderation comes in deciding what do we actually mean by moderate? Do we mean what is within the average for a particular culture and the particular time in which you happen to live? If our neighbors start calling our kids lazy bookworms, should we see that as a sign that we've exceeded the bounds of moderation and we should back off? Like, remember that back when books were more feared, spending excessive amounts of time with a textbook was also feared to rot the brain. Whereas nowadays, kids can regularly spend a third of their day staring at a book of some form or another. Like, clearly, earlier people would have found spending a third of a day staring at what they thought was just a dead tree was to be outside the bounds of moderation. But today it isn't. And if we decide that isn't outside the bounds of moderation, what if we were to take the exact same textbooks and deliver them via a screen? Now we have kids spending a third of their day staring at a digital screen. Does that make it suddenly outside the bounds of moderation, even when it's showing the exact same content as a textbook? Well, what if we add interesting animations to that digital textbook? Does that change it? And what if we add interesting and engaging characters to that digital textbook? What if it becomes entertaining and enjoyable? Is that what makes it less okay? Like, the simplest of guidelines around screen time are written as blanket statements, looking only at the physical form in which media is delivered. But once you get into any serious discussion around media limits, you pretty quickly have to acknowledge the importance not of what physical form something is delivered on, but the actual content being delivered and how it's being engaged with. But having to think about the actual content being delivered takes a lot of work. Rather than having a casual 5-minute conversation about screen time guidelines, we suddenly find ourselves listening to hours of YouTube videos just to scratch the surface. And it can be extremely tempting to avoid all that simply by saying that screen use is okay as long as it's done in moderation. After all, like, who could possibly argue with moderation, right? But what happens if we don't think about what moderation actually means? Certainly, we wouldn't want to put strict limits on the amount of time that a budding artist could spend with paint and a canvas. And similarly, there's a lot of missed opportunity when we put strict limits on the amount of time a kid can play with a photo editing program, a digital paint program, a storytelling program, an AI image generator, a digital tenorion, or any other number of digital arts that a budding artist would likely want to spend many standard deviations more time in than the average kid. To account for this, one of the easiest questions to ask when a kid, or even adult, is spending a large amount of time on a single activity is, are they doing so because they're deeply engaged and challenged by that activity? Or are they doing it essentially just to numb out and avoid other activities? If the answer is to numb out, then absolutely. Strong intervention, limits, maybe even elimination could be called for to determine like what's going on in that person's life and what it would take to productively reduce the amount of time they're spending on that activity, whatever it is, just digital, non-digital, anything else. But when they are deeply engaged and challenging themselves, then we need to look one level deeper into why they're so deeply engaged. And that's not to say that when they're deeply engaged, there isn't a problem. And absolutely, like, there can still be strong needs for intervention and limits, even when one is deeply engaged and challenged by an activity. Because in pretty much any activity where someone is deeply engaged and challenged, learning is taking place. And when learning is taking place, new neurons are growing, new connections are being made throughout the brain. And usually, when we think of growing neural connections and learning as a good thing, and usually they are, but we need to acknowledge that it can actually be a problem if what you're learning is not actually something that serves you well in life. Like, let's think about the arcade game Whack-A-Mole, where at certain intervals, a mole pops out of a hole, and your goal is just bash it as quickly as you can. Like, in my mind, this is the most primitive and bare bones video game design that could possibly exist. And if you were a kid living 10,000 years ago, it would actually be quite important for you to be playing games like this. And if you were to spend 4 hours a day practicing and learning and developing your ability to bash those moles as fast as you probably could, that may actually be a really useful thing. Today, however, if a significant portion of your brain was dedicated to neurons constantly itching to bash a mole as soon as you saw it, that may not be great and could warrant intervention. So part of that problem, yes, absolutely comes from spending so much time on one single activity. But the other part of it comes from how limited and impoverished that one single activity is. Like Whack-A-Mole as a game is truly one of the most fundamental and just elementary game designs in existence, with the only challenge coming from learning how to do one task faster and faster. But even if we were to make one simple change and make the challenge where instead of hitting the mole as fast as you possibly could, you had to first look if the mole had a particular feature, like only hit the moles who don't have a mustache, or only blue-colored moles, or something like that. As described in the other video in this channel summarizing the book Mind in the Making, already with that one change, you're learning and developing parts of your brain that are amongst some of the most important skills for our current modern-day world. And that's what happens when you make just one addition to the most primitive of games. Whereas most well-designed games nowadays have thousands of layers of intricate design and challenge, most of which actually do have remarkable overlap with the types of cognitive skills needed for operating in the modern world. And many kids' television shows are able to explain lots of important real-world concepts within stories that engage kids in ways nothing else can, with lots of opportunities for really deep engagement. So, when we look historically at the conversations that happen each time a new media form emerges, the pattern is that people first talk about limits and keeping within moderation, as defined by what everyone else in that particular society at that particular time is doing. But ultimately, the discussion evolves into looking at two key questions that I believe to be more productive. One, are they deeply engaging and challenging themselves, or are they simply numbing out and neglecting other important aspects of their life? Dr. Coworth's channel has plenty of great discussions about this topic already, and as a clinical psychologist, she has far more expertise than I do, so I'll leave this one to her content. I do, however, have a strong background in educational research, which is why in the next video, we'll look at the other important question to be asking. Number two, is what they're learning from that activity going to serve them well relative to the amount of time they're putting in? And can it be used to enhance other aspects of their life? So join me in the next video where we'll consider the possible strategy of saying, well, some screen time is okay, but I want to make sure it's only the educational stuff.